I probably ought to start with a little bit of background about myself in that I've been a network engineer for over 30 years. I will openly admit I started working with Novell NetWare 2.10, if you're curious, and Coax ArcNet. So the gray hairs I have really came from that generation. Through my travels, though, what I found is networks have a lot of intelligence. The sad part of that intelligence is that you have to dig at it, and you have to get 20 different tools to try and put things together to find out what's going on. And I figured all that manual digging needs to go away. There needs to be some automation. And so what I realized was missing in the world of networking was a high degree of automation to collect this intelligence, bring it back, bring back more information than other solutions, analyze it with a heuristics engine to be able to tell you what's working and what's broken in your environment. Because troubleshooting always got stalled with somebody saying, oh, 20 minutes ago we had this glitch. Okay, is it still happening? No. Well, I can't find it. That's the problem. If you knew what was going on with enough depth of understanding 20 minutes ago, you could solve the problem. So that was our primary purpose for creating the company, is automated network intelligence and analysis. Effectively, this means we're going to cover the entire network, looking at every interface on every switch, every router, every 5 minutes, but also go deep and collect a lot more information than what you get off of other solutions. That depth and breadth meant we knew more about glitches, hiccups, and gremlins than other products. Now, with all this information and the routing tables, bridge tables, spanning tree, all of the depth of information we collected, we realized this puts us in a unique position to do root cause troubleshooting for networks. And so our first foray was into solving problems for network folks. The second thing we dove into is solving problems for telecom, because telecom was a big problem for folks as they couldn't solve the root causes of call quality issues. Recently, we realized there's a lot of information we can offer to security professionals because we have insights into the network of what's going on that other products just don't have. So we figured we'd come out with Security Operations Manager. And so that's really what I'd like to present with you guys today is what we have with our new offering. So this is brand new. It's as fresh as, well, it's a month and a half, 2 months old. It's effectively, we announced and released this at RSA. But there's been kind of a slight delay between after the end of RSA and now. So effectively, I'll say this is still very new and very fresh. So I'm going to dive into the presentation and show what we're focused on doing so that you can see where we position ourselves in the market. So starting out is that security professionals are stuck having a lot of things that'll happen. Unknown IoT devices connected to the network, devices with default passwords, OS vulnerabilities, rogue equipment deployed, unencrypted protocol use, configurations not being backed up. The sad statement of affairs is all of these things can happen in the average network, and yet the security professionals are stuck with no situational awareness of what's going on with that network. The second problem that security folks are burdened with is you have a SIM or an IDS say, we just found a security event, and it says there's suspicious activity on this IP address. Go research this. Okay. You crack open your playbook and you realize there's 20 steps in this playbook, and you realize to be able to execute those 20 steps, you're going to have to use 10 different tools. And by the way, if you have multiple analysts, you're going to find out that not all of them are perfectly trained up on those 10 tools to be able to collect the information and analyze it and get through that runbook. And it's probably going to take 30 minutes of time to actually go through and execute that runbook. So with 30 minutes worth of time on each one of these events just means that you're never going to get to the bottom of your list at the end of the day, because you can only deal with maybe 12, maybe 15 events per day before you run out of hours. And that's just not realistic. So these are the problems that we've seen a lot of folks have. So the current SOAR limitations is you have a SOAR solution that says, hey, we're going to automate this. The problem is that you have to do integration with that SOAR solution to other solutions to try and source their data. That means you're going to slow down deployment because you have to make sure that the APIs are tied. You're going to have to make sure that the chain of dependencies is now created for that critical application. And there's also vendor API limitations as to how do they do this? Is it RESTful JSON? How are they providing the data? So this makes it so that a lot of SOAR solutions tend to end up having a bunch of delays. The other problem with a lot of SOAR solutions is that they take typically weeks to months worth of workflow programming, and that automation might only cover 50% of the event work. So there's a lot of promise with a complete SOAR solution, but there's a lot of problems that are preventing it from actually being useful immediately. So a lot of organizations I've spoken to have said, yeah, SOAR is a great promise, but it hasn't yet been delivered to folks. So this is what we focused on doing for Security Operations Manager, is we have a lot of this data already in our solution. So we figured we would present this in a manner that makes it easy to do this sort of analysis. So let's start with events. So you have your SIM or IDS say, we have suspicious activity on this IP address. What we're going to be able to do with one solution is be able to tell you instantly, here's where that's connected, what switch, what interface, what VLAN. We can also tell you, by the way, it's a Dell computer, so that you know the manufacturer of the device. We're going to tell you the operating system that's running, and we're going to tell you who's logged in. Now, we're going to go another step and be able to say, here are the rights, here's the rights and capabilities of that person so that you understand what the risk is associated with that user. We're going to tell you the processes that are running on the box so that you can say, well, this is starting to look bad. Also, it's communicating with a server in North Korea via SQL. Okay, this is starting to have bad written all over it. And by the way, that server, it's a known hack source. Do you want to quarantine? So with all of these indications of compromise, you're going to be able to say, yes, quarantine, get this off the network. Now, this means that with all of this information presented to you in one tool, it means your training costs are going to be a ton less for those analysts. It means they're going to be able to resolve these within 60 seconds. That means an event takes 1 minute to be able to say, yes, this is a bad actor, or no, it's a new analyst in the finance department, and it's completely legitimate. So it means your research is now down to 1 minute. So one tool, 1 minute exercise to get all of the enrichment you need to determine what's going on. Additionally, we source all of our data natively. There's no agents, no spans, no taps, and that's how we can end up being a very rapidly deployed solution because we're sourcing our data from NetFlow, SNMP, and Windows WMI. So another thing we have for helping to aid SecOps teams is vulnerability reporting. So we're synchronizing with NIST every 24 hours to be able to tell you about the published vulnerabilities on these switches, routers, gateways, and firewalls. That way, instead of spending time scanning and trying to fingerprint and determine what is the OS, we're just going to give you the list and say, here's what's broken. That way you can spend your time improving your operation and upgrade the OS. We also can set up communication policies. So let's say you have an IoT device that should only ever talk to its controller server. So you set up a policy for this, and if it talks to anyone else, I want to be made aware of it. That way, if 3 months later, this communication starts occurring, it's going to immediately trigger a policy violation alert. That way, you can go in and say, somebody misconfigured the firewall, let's go make the change to fix that. So we have global footprint understanding. We understand what's connected to the network, everything that's out there. So let's say you're reading your news feed in the morning and you find out there's a new vulnerability for Acme webcams. And you're sitting there thinking, I think we have some of these on the network. Or do we? I thought we got rid of them. No, maybe we didn't get rid of all of them. If you're unsure, we're going to be able to tell you, find all those Acme webcams, and we're going to say, yes, you have 3 of them on the network. Here's where they are. That way you know what's plugged into your network. And with one click, you're going to immediately be able to click in and find out which one of these are vulnerable, quarantine them, or upgrade them. So geographic risk awareness is something a lot of folks just don't seem to understand. And this is really important for banking as well as government. So if you don't know where your data is going, you've got a problem. So what we're able to do is tell you the country as to where your data is going, so that if you saw a report like this, you'd say, 8,000 flows going to Russia is bad news. That should not happen, especially if, let's say, you're a local municipal government. You can click in, it's going to end up showing you that you have something sending to port 80 in Severodonetsk, Russia, going through China Telecom, and we're going to flag it as high risk as a known hack source. That way you're aware of communications, of where that's going, and what the risk is associated. So if you have mystery new devices that pop into your network, within 5 minutes, we're going to be able to tell you, hey, this device here just connected. Here's what it is. Here's where it's connected. Here's who it's talking to. Here's what they're doing. Do you want to quarantine it? With all of that information at your fingertips, the minute somebody connects, you're going to know and say, yeah, we're going to control this and say this shouldn't be here. Additional things we've added to the product is exposure detection. We can tell you about unsecured protocol use, things like uncontrolled DNS, ARP poisoning, Smurf attack vulnerabilities, also rogue devices. So since we're aware of everything that's connected, where it's connected, what it's doing, we can tell you about rogue devices in the infrastructure, as well as all of your IoT devices. Because that's a huge mystery for a lot of folks is, people end up saying, gee, I think I have a network that has 5,000 nodes. No, actually you have 2,000 IoT nodes that you're not even thinking of that have been plugged in on your manufacturing floor, and you don't know who they're talking to. So if you knew what those IoT devices were doing, who they're talking to, whether it's legitimate, that would cover an additional exposure. Now, all of this capability is rapidly deployed. Again, you don't have to put out taps or span ports. All you need is a single server, typically a virtual machine, and put it in your data center. And if you have SNMP access from that server to all of the switches, all of the routers, gateways, and firewalls, and also NetFlow information, and you give it Windows WMI login credentials, and we're going to be able to give you all of this information in one solution. So with that rapid deployment, it means realistically within 30 minutes, you're going to have all of this data and be able to start taking action on the exposures, start seeing some of the flows that are going on. So this is not something that takes weeks of deployment or professional services. This is something that you can get going really within the first hour. You're going to be able to identify some exposures and start solving some problems in your environment. So that's the short and sweet of the solution. If you guys want to take a look at this yourself, I'm going to be going over this in the next segment. But if you want to take a look at this yourself, we have a sandbox you can go to and end up playing around with all of the features, all the capabilities.
When you say rapidly deployed, it's not like an OVF. You actually have to install an executable, and what does it run on?
So it's corrected, it's not an OVF. It is a Windows installer. It's an actual 80 megabyte Windows installer. It'll install on any version of Windows, including Windows Server, Windows Desktop, Windows 10, Windows 7. So really any version of Windows.
I'm not quite clear on who this is aimed at. Could you give me a bit more of an idea on what sort of companies you think that this is who are you targeting with this?
So we're primarily targeting mid-level companies that have one security person, or it might be a security/network person, and so they're dual roles. Typically, you'll have between 1,000 employee company and let's say a 20 or 30,000 employee company. So kind of a mid-market target.
I have just a quick question with all that. I guess you have always trouble a little bit to support all the thousands of different vendors. I guess you cover the big ones, but how is it if I have some obscure networking vendors in my environment, how easy is it for you to adopt additional vendors?
So actually, we automatically handle all of that. I'll admit to you, is our company has been around long enough where we have actually very lengthy experience with SNMP of being able to template and understand all of the different SNMP stacks that are out there. For example, when we started developing, we got some older equipment that was maybe 2002, 2003 type of network equipment that was some old 3-com switches. And so we're able to automatically get and dig at data no matter how old that equipment is. And so our support of those older devices just means that we have actually fantastic ability to target a network and say, doesn't make a difference whether you have Netgear, Adtran, Extreme, Cisco, Nexus, Meraki, whatever you have, we're going to be able to target that and be able to pull information and say, here's what the device knows that you ought to know.
And how is it with firewall vendors? Is this more challenging, or that is also working out?
Yeah, it is more challenging because most firewall vendors have very weak SNMP support. And to that end, what we've done is things like Palo Alto, for example, we've built into their API. And so if you give us the API key, we're going to suck a lot of data via their API directly. We're still going to get SNMP information off of it that we can get, but then we'll use the API to augment and cover bases that we just don't have through SNMP.
So maybe in the firewall world, you have to go that path with the API for many implementations.
Yeah, and it is just give us the API key and we're good to go. So effectively for a Palo Alto, what we need is SNMP credentials, community string, or SNMP v3 credentials, and the API key. So there's just one additional credential needed to be able to get all of the information off of those Palo Altos.
And last question regarding that, I also saw SD-WAN in one of the slides. Do you integrate also with the SD-WAN vendors already?
So we can pull information off of those vendors. We don't go as deep into those custom MIPS, but you can set up your own monitors if you want to be able to see additional statistics there. But we are going to show you the path taken for each of those separate SD-WAN connections. We're going to show you the stability, and we'll be able to show you performance metrics of the interfaces on the SD-WAN box to say, is it performing well? Is it dropping packets? Is it having problems?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, most of them are kind of a hybrid. They have also firewall functions that maybe are only available with custom MIPS and so on. Yeah, okay.
I had a quick question, Tim, just regarding the the communications policy monitoring and the geographical monitoring. Is there any kind of baselining done with that? And would there be any sort of alerting on other forms of abnormal traffic changes? So something suddenly stops talking to another server versus starting up. Is there kind of a baseline there? And then does it use that to determine alerting?
So right now we can trigger alerts if there is communications with a blacklisted country. They're effectively, with our first foray, we're not doing the analysis to that level yet where we're able to say, gee, this communications has occurred before, therefore permitted. But with our next generation release, we will have more analysis of being able to say, this is normal behavior for your network, or this is more abnormal behavior. So we are going to be adding some behavior detection.
What does your underlying storage look like for all of this data? It seems like a fair amount of data between SNMP and the NetFlow data you collect. Is it like an SQL database, something proprietary, somewhere in between?
Yeah, so we use SQLite. And if you're familiar, it's a database that is coded directly into an application, and that's really what we did. So one of the things that's different about our backend is we're all coded in C. So C and C++. And so the benefit of that is that we can run on lower end hardware and get far better performance than a lot of the other languages that are out there. That also allows us to have far better performance with our database, because it being directly compiled into our application means that there's no interlaying ODBC connection, there's less support needed, less things that can break, and far better performance.
I have a question. So from kind of how I understand what you're saying is that it's aimed at kind of a 1 to 2 person team that's doing this, but also like, how do I say this? When it comes to like my deployments for a SIEM, for example, I have a really good retention policy based on the type of data coming in, what it's doing, everything. Is there a way that I can be very granular about I want to store this data longer, or is it more of a you're expecting that data, like it's analyzing it but not storing it? If that makes sense.
Yeah, so it is analyzing and storing the data, and so the storage, I'm going to say, by default, the performance information we keep for 13 months on every interface, every device. Again, with using SQLite, it means our record size is very controlled, so therefore it doesn't take up as much disk space as many other solutions. And also, by taking up less disk space, it gives us better performance because I/O is a lot less. So the performance information we end up keeping for 13 months by default. You can adjust that to say, gee, if I have a large 200,000 node network, you might not want to keep that duration of data, figuring that I don't want a 100 gigabit or gigabyte data store for this. Really, a lot of these larger organizations that we have as customers, they choose to say, we don't care what happens 2 months ago. We're troubleshooting problems that have happened within the past couple of weeks. That's enough for us. On the flip side, if you have a government mandate of saying this information must be stored for 5 years, you can choose that as well.
But can it be granular in the sense of I can say this data I want to keep for this amount of time, this data I want to keep for that amount of time, or is it all the data has to be within this?
Yeah, so you can choose to trim and truncate however you prefer. And there's a number of different models you can use or templates you can use for the trim and truncate, or we can work with you with professional services to get a custom trim and truncate mechanism put in place to say, what data do you want to retain, how long do you want to retain it, and what is your mandate?
Sorry, I'm on the wrong window. So if I wanted to customize it myself, I would have to write that in, like, would you have a config file I could adjust it in, or is it something that I have to actually customize fully with program?
Yeah, so you could. So what we have is we have a number of different cleanup scripts, and you just choose which cleanup script would you prefer to use. If the cleanup the scripts that are there are not matching what your mandate is, then we can help create one for you. Or you can create one. It's effectively, it's a SQL script. So if you know SQL, you can end up writing it yourself. Otherwise, we can write it for you. So there's a number of ones that you can choose to use, or we can customize something.